But if you look at it simply as a document, it's very thin. So I said, I don't know what else. Have you got anything else? What else do you have? And they said, well, we have this script by James Cameron that we didn't use. And I said, you mean James Cameron as in the Terminator? And they said, yes. And now this is before Terminator 2. This is before Aliens. This is James Cameron in his early period. And I said, well, I think I better look at the screenplay. And the idea, it was clear why they didn't use it, because Rambo had a sidekick in it. And the only person I felt who could have been the sidekick was John Travolta, whom Sylvester had just directed in Staying Alive, the sequel to Saturday Night Fever. And they had gotten along well, I gather. And it seemed as if, hey, they'll work together, and this time Travolta will be the comic kid on the mission with Rambo. Well, that wasn't going to fly. And there were also some early scenes in which Rambo was in a mental institution in the basement in a locked cell with a armed guard outside saying he thinks he's, the armed guard says of Rambo, he thinks he's the Prince of Darkness. And the producers were very afraid of making Rambo seem not in his right mind. So they didn't want the insane asylum sequence. And there were a lot of other scenes that were really, really cool, just wonderful scenes that they didn't use. So I said to the producers, remembering that they absolutely needed this for their marketing, I said I would do the novelization if I had the right to expand the story. In the normal novelization, a writer is hired, he's paid very little, and he or she is told simply to take the screenplay, use the dialogue as written, and expand it into a book by describing a lot of stuff. And I said I wasn't prepared to do that, but that I would, if they were willing, this is what I would do. There would be 1/3 the actual shooting script, so they'd recognize the movie. There'd be 1/3 James Cameron with all that extra stuff that they didn't use. And there'd be 1/3 me making this the Rambo that I would recognize. So it was an extremely unusual, perhaps the most unique novelization ever written. And it really got followers. It was 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, which, with a few exceptions, never happens. Never happened. Novelizations aren't really current anymore. So it was very interesting to do the novelization as an experiment, and knowing that I was breaking new ground and doing stuff that was very, very different. So it was fun to write.
Yeah, it must be after 13 years being able to go back to the character.
Well, it's more than 13 years. The movie came out in 1985.
Oh, it's true. Yeah.
This is now approaching, what, the 30th anniversary? Yeah. Next year will be the 30th anniversary. So it's been more than 15
years. No, but
years.
I mean, at the time of writing it, being able to...
Well, I see what you're saying. Yes. Well, actually, the novel First Blood came out in 1972.
Yeah.
And the film came out in 1982. And of course, that was a heroic thing in itself. There were 26 scripts and 5 studios involved. And at one time, Steve McQueen was Rambo with Sidney Pollack, one of my favorite directors, as director. But Steve McQueen was 45 years old when they were going to make that in the mid-70s, and it simply wouldn't work because there were no 45-year-old Vietnam veteran in 1975. It was a young person's war, unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, from the American point of view, where the average military personnel was maybe 45 years old. So everything got turned around. Anyhow, it was, so the movie came out 10 years after the novel, and then they knew they could do the sequel, so 3 years later the sequel came out.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And then boom, you know, like Rambomania just took off. Like,
well, the first movie had been very, very popular. First Blood. Some people call it Rambo, and I can understand that, but that's not the title. That's the title of the fourth film. The first movie is called First Blood. And it did very well. It did extremely well. Rambo First Blood Part 2 was off the charts. It was extraordinary. That summer was, in 1985, was just absolutely extraordinary. It was easily the summer of Rambo. He was everywhere. And the novelization was summarized in newspapers, even. The attention that the character got was overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like I've been doing so much research to do this podcast. Like in the beginning, it kind of was like a personal blog, and then, you know, like I started discovering all these other people who had Rambo art and stuff like that, and try to, you know, create a place where we could kind of like just hang out and show everybody's Rambo stuff.
Right.
And while like doing the research, I thought in the beginning. I thought I could do it in 12 episodes, and I quickly realized it would take like hundreds.
Well, you might want to cut back on that. But.
Yeah, there's just so much. Great stuff out there, and like even like the season. Like right now we're in season 2. We're talking about the second movie, and I've had to kind of like stretch it out 3 times now, just because there was so much going on in that era, like when you get to Reagan, and when you get to this, and when you get to that.
Ronald Reagan, as we know, adopted Rambo in the sense that he referred to the character frequently in press conferences and speeches, sometimes making you nervous. In a famous press conference, he said, "I saw a Rambo movie last night. Now I know what to do the next time there's a terrorist hostage crisis." And it may be he was joking. It was hard to tell. But some people took him seriously and thought that he was advocating, "Oh, what the hell, let's just go in and you know, just blow everything up." And in fact, I was in England I can't say the date for sure. It was in the 1980s when the United States bombed. I'm drawing a blank on the country where Gaddafi, Libya, and I was on a publicity tour in England, and the London Times had a headline that said, "U.S. Rambo jets bomb Libya." So the character became very politicized in ways that are ironic, given that the novel is essentially a book about the cost that war has on its veterans. So it got very complicated.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. Definitely. A lot of times I find in the media and such, Rambo gets a bad rap, and you know, I think people should just look more into the character.
Well, speaking of which, the movies are inconsistent in the character, as they are from the novel. The novel's character is someone who's furious at what happened to him in the war, and what he learned about himself as a person who was good at killing. The movie took his anger and transposed it into a meekness that made him a victim. That's First Blood. The second movie, Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3, reversed it and made him, the word is jingoistic, in which he is basically a poster child for aggressive military action. And this was not the character of the book or the first movie. So the character existed in that strange state in those two. And then in the fourth movie, Sylvester called me before it was released to tell me what his intentions were. And he said that he, in retrospect, wasn't happy with the second and third films because they glamorized the violence of war. And that he liked the first movie a lot, but that he thought the first movie hadn't really done justice to the character in the book. And then in the fourth movie, he was going back, not to the plot, but to the character as I described him in the novel. And in the fourth movie, Rambo can't get clean. He stands forever in the rain. He's washing himself all the time. It's like, like blood on his hand. And there's a scene, it was never commented on by reviewers. I never heard anybody speak about it. It's the most astonishing speech in the fourth movie, where he's determined not to go back to combat because he knows what it brings out in him. And finally, to rescue the missionaries, he's going to do it one more time. And he's in the forge making the knife, and we hear him thinking. And what he says is, admit it, you didn't kill for your country, you killed for yourself, and for that God will not forgive you. So that in theory he's going to save the missionaries as a way of redeeming his soul. No one ever talked about that. And I thought it was absolutely mind-blowing that line would be in a Rambo movie, because that's more or less the novel.
Yeah, because when you look at the novel, through, I would say most of the novel, Rambo is fighting himself. He's always fighting himself. You're always in his head. He's always fighting himself. And I would think maybe that's why they called it Rambo, because in the novel, he's referred to as just Rambo.
Fourth movie.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, the fourth movie. In the novel, he's referred to as just Rambo.
No, he's not called that even.
And
he's
the kid.
The
from First Blood, I mean. But in the fourth one, the movie's called Rambo. I would think that maybe that's why, because in the novel, they didn't really. You didn't mention his name or anything. It was just Rambo.
No, the character does not have a first name in the novel. That is correct. To humanize him, because the producers were so afraid that he would be seen as being too aggressive, they entered, John, and when Johnny comes marching home, it's the only name he could have. But in the fourth movie, interestingly, I doubt he's called Rambo a half dozen times.
I think maybe one time. I think they called him. I think they call him. I think it's only the missionary guy who calls him Rambo when he comes to ask him to help.
Right.
To help go look for the missionaries. I think that's the only time.
Sylvester's a very literary sense. And the boatman in literature is always a reference to the boatman on the river Styx who transports dead souls to Hades. So basically, when they're calling him the boatman again and again and again, they're calling him death.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff in that movie that wasn't understood or acknowledged. And I think people perhaps don't know how to watch movies, and they just get taken up in the immediacy of it without paying attention to stuff that's underneath. But there are a lot of problems with the fourth movie, but that aspect of it was very intelligent.
Was there ever any talk about doing a fourth novelization?
No. Carolco, the company that owned the rights to the first three films to make them, I was on very good terms with them. Mario Casar and Andy Vanya, I saw them every time I went to Los Angeles, and we talked on the phone often, and we were in a cooperative venture.